Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to go into a little bit deeper, diving into the narrative. Yesterday we talked about narrative structure in general and the different types of narrative, and today we are going to dive into narrative a little bit deeper and look at the different pieces of narrative and look at how you can tell if something is a narrative. So before we get started, you should have a piece of paper that looks something like this. If you don't have this piece of paper, you need to get with your teacher and get it because these are guided notes for this lesson. So you need these before you get started. So if you don't have those, just pause the video, go grab those, and then come back and click continue. So this is kind of an overview of what we talked about yesterday, but narrative is a type of a text structure, and typically we just think of narrative as being a story, but it can be either fiction, which is made up, or nonfiction, which is true. So if you're following along on your guided notes, I'm going to give you the first one just to make sure we're on the same page. So the first one says, a narrative is a type of, and so there are two blanks there. So under a narrative is a type of, you should have text structure. If you haven't already got that, you need to write that down. So narrative is a type of text structure. Okay, so you should be able to get the rest of these as you go along as well. All right, so what does that mean for today? So today we're going to discuss how you can tell if a text is a narrative, and specifically we're going to look at certain clues in the text that can help you figure this out, and those include narrator, dialogue, setting, and plot. So you should be at least semi-familiar with these, but we're just going to dive a little bit deeper in them today and really dig into each one individually and how they contribute overall to the narrative. So the first one we're going to look at is the narrator. So the narrator is the voice the author uses to tell you what happens next. And before I go any further, I just want to remind you that you can pause this video at any time, especially since you're doing guided notes. You can pause the video and write down your answer and then continue playing. So if you need to do that, you can go ahead. But the narrator is the voice the author uses to tell you what happens next. The narrator may or may not be in the story, and we're going to really dive into that in just a second. But does the narrative voice use personal pronouns such as I, me, us, or we? If the answer to that is yes, then the narrator is a part of the story. So we're going to start with that one. So an example of the narrator in the story, I'm going to read this little section to you. It says, I hated science. I really did. I used to think it was boring, but then Mr. A started to teach at my school. He did some crazy things in class to get the attention of the class. He said it was his job to make us like science, and he did his job very well. So this kind of narrator can tell you his or her own thoughts, but does not usually know the thoughts of others. So our clues here, we know that our narrator, the person telling the story, he is a part of the story. He was in the class. I hated science. So because of the clues I and us, let's see, where is that part? He did some crazy things in class to get the attention of the class. He said it was his job to make us like science. So I, us, those kinds of things let us know that he was there. He is a part of the story. So those are your clues. This is also called first person point of view. So that's important to know as well. First person point of view. It's not on the actual slide, but that's what it's called. So when the narrator is in the story, it's called first person point of view. This is one example of that. Now we're going to switch over and look to when the narrator is not a part of the story. So it says, suppose the narrator does not use I or me, or in the last example, us, at all. Instead, the narrator only uses character names, or he, or she, or they to tell what happens. In this case, the narrator is not a character in the story. So they are kind of I like to imagine it like standing outside of a window and looking in and telling what they see happening. Some other people like to say they're looking down on the earth and telling what they're seeing. So they're not actually involved in the story. They're kind of standing outside and telling what they're seeing. So the example says, long ago, a lion ruled a jungle. The lion was king of all the creatures in the jungle. He became king because no other creature could fool him. Most of the creatures that lived in the jungle liked the lion, but one creature did not. A tiny mosquito disliked the king. So clearly, our narrator, whoever is telling the story, is not a part of the story himself or herself. They're just outside talking about what they see. So this type of narrator usually knows everything about the characters, including their thoughts. And this is going to be third person point of view. Okay, so moving on to dialogue. We've talked a lot about dialogue this year, so I'm going to go pretty quickly, but it is the words spoken by the characters. It has quotation marks around it, obviously, which kind of signals you to let you know the words being said by a character. It's often used to give readers information about characters and events and helps move the story along. That's the big thing that I want us to focus on, is the fact that it helps move the story along, and we can learn a lot about the characters through the dialogue. You guys already know how to identify dialogue. You know that it's got quotation marks. You know all of that stuff. But the big thing that I want us to start doing is analyzing dialogue and thinking about what do we learn from the character through their dialogue, and what do we learn about the plot through the dialogue, and that kind of thing. So I want us just to start looking at it a little bit more deeply. So in the example, it says, "How rich is my friend Midas?" the smiling man said. "No other man in the world has as much." "I wish it were more," said Midas. "And it takes so much labor to get. I'm tired of working so hard for each small coin. How I wish that everything I touch could change to gold." So what do we learn about the character just in this little tiny bit of dialogue? It tells you that Midas is rich, but he is not happy. He wishes that he didn't have to work so hard to gain his gold. So just from that little bit, we've learned a lot. Setting. This is my favorite of the four. Setting, time and place. I like to write from a lot of different settings because it's so much fun to see how the setting can change the story. But the setting is where and when the actions and events take place. They can give background information about the characters and help set the mood of the story. That's my favorite part. It helps set the mood of the story. So for our example, it says, "What is the setting?" in the following example. So be thinking about that as I read. It says, "It was a dark September morning. There was a storm at sea. A ship had sailed close to the shore and crashed on some sharp rocks. It had been split in two by the powerful waves. Half of the ship had been carried to the bottom of the sea. The other half of the ship lay on the rocks. Some of the crew was still alive, but the waves were dashing over the wreck. In a little while, the waves would carry it to the bottom as well." So this setting describes a dark morning. There was a storm at sea, a ship crashed on the rocks, and only some of the crew still was alive. So it lets you know from the start that the characters are in trouble and that they need help. It also helps to set the mood that is scary and tense. So again, if this same situation had taken place somewhere else, it would be a very different story. So the setting definitely influences the plot, and again, setting is both the time and the place that the story is happening. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about plot. And the plot is the events that make up the story. This is just your story. It is just literally the things that happen in the story. It sounds more complicated than it is, but in narrative specifically, there are three basic parts, and we talked about these at the beginning of the year, but I just wanted to make sure that we reviewed those, and that's going to be incident response and reflection. So we're going to talk about those really quick. But again, you're welcome to pause and go back and listen to me re-explain if I go too fast. So incident is at the very beginning. The beginning is going to give you the information on the characters and the setting, but it's also going to give you an incident that lets us know the conflict or the problem. So for example, we're going to read a little story here. This is our beginning. It says, "Grandpa, why are you closing the fishing camp?" Jake asked. "Why now?" "I can't pay the bills," Grandpa said. "Remember when I lost my job last year? Well, there hasn't been much money. Can't you get help?" "I've tried," Grandpa shook his head. Sorry, I'm trying to hurry, so I'm not doing very good inflection here. "I've tried," Grandpa shook his head. "Times are hard, very hard. I love Camp Emerson. It's my life. I sure will miss those kids this summer." So what is our incident? And I don't think I put this on your guided notes, so I'll just go ahead and talk about it. What is the incident here? Well, the incident is that the money's gone and Grandpa is going to have to close the camp. Okay, so response, how do the characters react to that? So this is the middle of the story. Usually this is the main event. If you remember back in Phaethon, it was his whole journey to his father's palace to try to drive the chariot, remember, because of his response to the conflict, which is the argument. But anyway, in this case, so how are they going to respond to the closing of the farm? So it describes the high point or the point at which the problem changes. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to let you pause this and read this through. If my video is in the way, you should be able to move it out of the way. If not, just read down to the very last line. But go ahead, pause this video, read the response, and then come back and push play when you're done reading. Okay, so if you're back, you should have already read this page, the response. And so in this page, we've learned that Jake is trying to figure out ways to raise money to keep the farm open. He's trying to help his grandpa. So this is the middle of the story. This is how he responded to the conflict. But unfortunately, his friend and his parents were not able to come through for him, and he's not sure how he's going to be able to help raise the money. Finally, the reflection is at the very end, so it's how the problem is fixed, and it's basically what the character learns from the entire experience. And so for our example, oh, we don't have the end of our example. One second. Okay, I had to pause you guys for 1 second. Now we have a reflection example. So this is the end of our story. So 2 weeks have passed. Over 100 fishermen signed up for a contest. They paid $50 each. The prize was $500. With the money left over, Jake's grandfather would be able to save the camp. The day of the contest came. Jake's parents drove him to the lake. At the camp, Jake got out of the car. His father stopped him. "Son, I am so proud of you. You wanted to save the camp, and you did. We know it means a lot to Grandpa." "Thanks, Dad," Jake said. Then he ran to his grandpa. "We did it, Grandpa," he yelled. So, reflection, they learned what did they learn? Well, they learned that some things are so important that it's worth the hard work to save. And so he had to get creative, but he was able to do that. So this is a recap of just kind of everything that we've talked about. So clues such as the narrator, dialogue, setting, and plot can help you recognize narrative text. Your narrator is your speaker, so they can be in the story or they can just be telling the story. They don't have to be a part of the story to tell the story, but they can. The dialogue, what the characters are saying out loud, we learn a lot from the dialogue. We learn about the characters, we learn about the setting, we learn about the plot and how it moves forward. The setting is the next one. It's the time and place. It's my favorite. Is it set in a spooky haunted house, or is it set on a beautiful beachy island? Where is it set, and how does that change the story? And then finally, the plot is the events that make up the story, the different things that happen throughout the story. And specifically in narrative, they have 3 basic parts: the incident, the response, and the reflection. If you have any questions on any of this, feel free to come see me or your literacy teacher. If you have any questions on the narrative guided notes, same thing. If there's anything that you need to go back and watch, you can do that. Just pause this and skip backwards so that you can get any blanks that you might have missed. And on the next slide, there will be a quiz. So you can use your notes on the quiz. So that will be good. That should help you out. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Good luck.